Welcome back to Zane Customs. In this week's episode, I'm going to be showing you how I made this custom 3D printed bust. This is a print I did a while ago, and some of you guys who watch my channel might recognize this actual design. I sculpted this guy a few months back and just always wanted to print it out and paint it up, and you can see the print failed. There's a lot wrong with it. You can see all these gaps in his torso and even the little pedestal stand that he's sitting on. There's gaps. The head looks good, but other than that, the other two pieces failed. So what I decided to do was take another failed print, which is this kind of lighter blue resin I got here, and I cut it up into a bunch of different squares, and I'm going to sand these until I get some kind of crystal shapes, and I'm going to glue those on the inside of the gaps from my from the bust. I just thought, instead of having to reprint this and having even more failed pieces, why not try and make something even cooler out of this? And I think it worked out. I'm actually really happy with the process. And here, these are the crystals that I was telling you about. They're pretty easy. I just would sand it till I got a flat face, rotate it a couple degrees, sand it again, and you want a bunch of flat faces, but you don't want them to be too perfect, too square, otherwise they won't really look like crystals. And then the same thing when you go to make the point. They're just a bunch of flat sides that they're at different angles to make a point. So you can see here, I went ahead and carved some notches into the side of this guy's head, and that was just because I really like the flow of the crystals going up the pedestal into the torso, and thought it would look better if it followed all the way up into his head. And then other than that, all I really need to do is glue the guy together, which I've done, and I actually glued them together and did a base coat of gloss black, and you'll see why I did that in a little bit. But what I'm doing here is I'm actually gonna fill in all these gaps with epoxy sculpt. And for any of you who don't know, I'm sure most of you don't, epoxy sculpt is essentially epoxy clay. You mix up two different parts of clay, and it reacts just like clay. It's a lot more sticky and harder to work with, but it's pretty similar. And then when it hardens, it's as hard as a rock. So what I'm trying to do here is darken it, and I thought this would be a good idea, taking some of this colored pencil lead, but it was way too waxy, and I couldn't really grind it down into a powder, so it didn't really work. What I ended up doing is just getting my epoxy sculpt, you can see here, and then I just mixed some paint with it, and I had to do quite a bit of just some black acrylic paint for it to really stain the clay a dark color, because you can see it's a pretty light gray right here. And I was trying to get a nice deep black, like you can see on the statue to the side there. So it took some doing, but I was able to actually get to a color I really liked. And again, this is epoxy clay, so you gotta mix these two parts together and be pretty thorough. You don't want to end up with any uncured parts in the future, because it'll just be a soft part of your statue, or a really sticky part or something that just didn't fully cure. So you want to make sure you mix them really well. And you can see here, just adding a little bit of black, it's already darkening it up, and I ended up having to do a lot more than I thought I would need to. But the reason I want this epoxy clay to be black is because I can't really go back and paint it afterwards, because I'm going to be setting the crystals directly into this epoxy. And this was the best idea I could come up with, because I wanted these crystals coming out of the statue, and I didn't want it to look too uniform. I wanted it to look natural and kind of sporadic. So I wanted these crystals to be literally growing out of the statue, and I could place them in there and use super glue and different things to hold them, but I didn't think it would be very strong. But I know how strong epoxy sculpt is, and I thought that would be probably my best bet, to just fill in all the gaps with epoxy sculpt and just take each individual crystal and just push it into place. And that's easier said than done, because the epoxy sculpt doesn't, you can't just push it in and have it form around your crystal perfectly and hold it. You do kind of have to work the clay and kind of force it to grab onto the crystals. It wasn't too hard, but just time consuming, and You know, it's still clay at this point, so as you're adding in other crystals, you might accidentally bump another one and then it'll fall out and different things. Once it's fully cured, these crystals are rock solid. I actually took a pair of pliers and pulled on some of them just to make sure, and they're not going anywhere. They'd probably break off before they came out of the epoxy. And this was pretty time consuming and kind of tedious work because I really wanted it to look good. Again, I didn't want it to look too uniform. I wanted it to look natural, so I had to really take my time, and it's sped up so much you can't really tell, but I would place a crystal and I would oftentimes end up moving it back and forth until I got something I was happy with. You can see here kind of how it's looking. Yeah, you can see kind of how the epoxy sculpt wraps around each different piece of crystal. Ended up looking really good. Again, the epoxy sculpt is gray and didn't end up being quite as dark as I wanted it to be, so I do eventually go in with a dark wash and wash over that whole section just to try and darken it up a bit. And it wasn't too big of a deal on the crystals because it's just a wash, so you can wipe it off really easy. And also I added in this little metal pin because he's supposed to have a little cigarette or a cigar, and unfortunately that piece broke off in the printing process. And you know, I could have printed another one, but it would have been a tiny piece and would have probably broken off again. So I just drilled this tiny hole and shoved this little metal pin in, and that's gonna hold a lot better. And yeah, here I am doing that wash I was talking about, and it helps to just blend the crystal into the actual statue a little bit more. I don't really want the focus of the statue to be where the crystals and the statue meet. You know, I kind of leaving that ambiguous. And here, this is why I painted this whole thing with a gloss black, because I was going over it with this chrome paint. It's really awesome paint from Molotov. I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but it's meant for markers, but you can paint with it, put it in your airbrush, or do anything you want with it. And my idea was I wanted it to look almost like a patinaed copper, which is like the Statue of Liberty, where it kind of turns that green color. I didn't want it to be that solid of a green, but I wanted it to be somewhere like that. So I thought having a base coat of metal and then I could tint it green and do all these things would look cool. But in the end, that didn't really work out. You'll see later on. But as cool as this looks, having this chrome paint go over everything, it was a little bit of a waste of time because I ended up just going over all of it with something else in the end. And here's that final thing all chromed out. Actually looks pretty cool on its own. Could definitely do with some weathering or something, but again, I was trying to go for that nice green tone. So what I'm doing here is using some tie-dye paints. This is what I use to dye any translucent prints that I do. I was hoping this would work, but this chrome paint, I don't know how it works, but it's just so smooth that everything runs off it, and it just ends up, this whole thing ended up looking really bad. So what I did was just paint over it all with my airbrush paints with this green and a little bit of dark blue for the shadows to get more of what I was going for. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to record that because I was in a little bit of a rush to get this done, but yeah, I just ended up having to airbrush all that. And you can also see with the crystals, I used a little bit of that dark blue tie-dye to make the crystals more of a dark blue color, which is what I was initially wanting. And then here I'm just taking a copper or bronze dry brush and going over to highlight all these details, because again, I want this to look like it's copper that's been aged and patinaed. So I do want a little bit of that shown through still. And also, you know, you spend all the time sculpting these characters out, that when you print them and you paint them, if they're all this solid color, you're not gonna really see the details. You need to add highlights and shadows and all these things to really show off your work. So this was probably the funnest part of the whole process for me, is this dry brushing stage, because you really get to see how awesome the sculpt looks. And after I finish dry brushing this, then I'll go ahead and do a matte coat over the whole thing to protect it, and then I'll actually paint on a gloss coat over the crystals to make them look nice and shiny. And they don't look as impressive with the matte coat on them, but adding the gloss coat makes them look more like, you know, you would imagine a fantasy crystal would look like. And also it just gives the whole bust a little bit more variety with different lusters to different parts of different objects in the bust, and different things like that. I think having some matte tones and some gloss tones makes your piece look a lot better. And that's the finished piece right there. I'm super happy with it. Again, this was this was a mistake. This was a failure in the printing process, but this turned out so good in the end. And before I go, I just want to say thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in a couple weeks with my next video.